you sent me a Facebook message about a comment I left on a Facebook thread. Could you remind me which comment that was? Because I really don't remember specifically which one it was.
Honestly, I can't remember
That's fine.
either. I talked to a lot of people, so the thing was, I think it had to do with something along the lines of, obviously, there's a lot of talk about what's happening in the world with ISIS and such, and there's a lot of people pretty heated about the topic. Doesn't matter from what background they come from. It just seems like it sparked a lot of conversation around it. And what I noticed is, in particular, there were certain questions that you had that you kept posing to people, and they failed to respond in either a reasonable or rational way that really gave validity to their perspectives. And really, honestly, it just pushes people away. And so the reason I reached out to you was, hey, my goal here was not to be divisive. I actually wrestled with these subject matters, and even as a Christian, it's something that's near and dear to my heart because to give a little background on myself, I know you wanted to go first, but
No, go ahead.
Just to dive right in, the reason I was so keen to discuss with you this subject was I looked at it from an outside perspective going, man, this guy is just getting train wrecked by a lot of people who are naming the name of Christ rather than just saying, hey, really, what qualms do you have? What are the true issues that we're really wrestling with? And I never really wrestled with these things until I actually became a Christian. And so I think I come from a unique perspective. And that's why I was like, man, let me just talk to you offline here so that we can actually have a reasonable and rational discussion rather than arguing or debating in a public area that doesn't really give people the right to, or like we're doing face to face now, the true heart behind the subject matter is hard to translate across through just texting or writing. And so I really appreciate this. I'm super thankful for you inviting me on.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to pull up. I think I know exactly which question it was. And I'll read that here. But you're a Christian, obviously. Yes. You said that. Let me think how I can ask this. What are you, Protestant? Are you Catholic? What denomination are you?
That's a really good question. I would consider myself non-denominational.
So you're not Catholic, I would assume.
Correct. Yes, I'm not Catholic.
And I'm just trying to get to a baseline to kind of understand your beliefs a little bit.
Yep.
Are you a Calvinist? Do you believe predestination? That type of thing?
I guess what better off is, what do the scriptures say regarding the things? Trying to place a label on the theological perspectives that I hold, or the hermeneutic, or however you'd like to try to box me into a certain perspective.
And I'm not. I'm just trying to figure out where you're coming from.
Yeah, I would say that I've been exposed to Calvinism. I've been exposed to many of the different theological perspectives. I would have to say that I do hold nearly to some of those views and some of those perspectives. There's some things that I'm still wrestling with. But if you really look at what I would consider the essentials of the faith, being the number one issues, those tend to be secondary or third. Some would argue otherwise, in some ways making it essential when it's really not. The idea behind it is, I believe the gospel message is, as far as Jesus walked this earth perfectly, that he was born of virgin birth. I believe that he did die for our sins, and I do believe that he resurrected from the dead and appeared to many, and that he ascended to the Father in heaven, and that he will at one day return. So I like to stay with the essentials rather than getting, sidetracked off onto maybe theological matters that would be debated amongst the Christian perspectives.
That's fair. I found the comment in the thread here, which sparked you contacting me. The original post was, Islam is marketed as a peaceful religion, but if it really were, wouldn't its extremists be extremely peaceful? And my response to that, and it was from Mark Spence from Living Waters, Red Comforts Ministry.
Yeah.
And I've actually had some contact back and forth with Mark. He's a pretty smart guy, but I think Mark considers himself a predestination Calvinist. So,
Okay.
um, and my response was,
Honestly, Mark's a very close friend of mine, and I actually
"Oh,
don't know.
great."
So I don't know. I didn't even know that.
I'm assuming so from the very little back and forth I've had with him.
Yeah.
You're like, I haven't interviewed him or anything, but just the back and forth I've had.
Okay.
And I wouldn't even call him my friend, just we've
Sure.
sent messages back.
Sure.
But my response was, doesn't this same logic apply to Christianity? Extremists would be those like Westboro Baptist or those who blow up abortion clinics.
Okay.
And the back and forth you were discussing was where people were like, well, no, because those aren't real Christians. And I said, but that's the same logic Muslims would use. The peaceful Muslims would say, well, those aren't real Muslims. They're not practicing the real Muslim faith. And people would then quote the Quran and say, well, they can't say that because the Quran says this. And then I would say, but the Muslims also use the exact same words, the very exact same logic you're using with the Bible. And I would, and it went on from there.
Okay. I appreciate you reminding me because yeah, thank you. Yeah, I don't recall that completely. So yeah. So what's your question?
So do you agree that that's the same logic that there are Christians who do things evil, if you want to use the word evil. There's Christians who kill people. There's Christians who commit genocide. Even today in 2015 in Africa, there's people committing genocide because they believe their Christian faith tells them to. But you would probably say those aren't real Christians. But does that same logic not apply to ISIS and those peaceful members of Islam?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. When you really look at it for what it is, and having studied a bit of Islam, not completely, obviously, I don't have a complete understanding of it, but enough to say, no, I can't. What I can't resolve is having spent some time in the Quran, enough to say, if you were truly holding true to the perspectives, just being orthodox, what is orthodoxy? And man, we could argue that to ad nauseum, right? When I look at those perspectives and I just try to wrestle with them and I think that, let me pause real quick. I'm gonna push the pause button. If I were to go back in time, I think it's fair to say, I'm going to give you a little backstory on myself. I am not what would be called a quote unquote professional Christian. I don't do this on a regular basis. This is not something I'm accustomed to. Matter of fact, I'm a little bit nervous about this phone call.
Oh, you're fine.
Yeah, I know. I appreciate it. And I try to really give things an honest perspective, which is why I wanted to hash this out. And so my background is I did not grow up in a Christian family. My father would be probably closer to agnostic or atheist. He made fun of us for going to church when I was growing up. My mom has been a believer, but hadn't had a lot of influence because of my dad, because I really looked up to my dad. And so I share that to say that does influence a lot of my perspectives coming into Christianity. And the reason for that is I don't have this large background of I've always been going to church. I always understood certain principles of certain things. I've really had to wrestle through them almost from an outside perspective looking in. I didn't have a lot of that groundwork that maybe many other people that you talk to. So another thing is I look at really what happened to me. Why did I become a Christian is a really good example. Someone shared the gospel with me and it immediately resonated with me. And so what I did was, instead of like most people, just I go to church and I'll do the thing, it's part of the liturgy. I came to it from a skeptics almost. Like, look, I see this, it resonates with me, I understand what you guys are saying, but man, I want to search these things out, because if I'm going to appeal to this thing that you call Christianity, I'm going to have a hard time wrestling through it. I want to know for a fact. I want to know that I know that I know that it is true, right? Because if it is true that what Jesus is saying, right, he's telling lies, he's a psychopath, or and pardon me, I'm from California. Bro is telling the truth, right? So I pardon my simplistic views. So I come into it with a real fresh slate, if you will. I don't have a lot of these presuppositions that I'm bringing into it outside of what I experienced.
Let
So I
me.
share that. Go ahead.
The last thing I want to do on this call is to attempt to argue with you or debate with you
Sure.
on how I feel the
Totally.
argument to Jesus, because
No, that's fine. Yeah.
and the reason I say that is just I'm not saying I'm a great debater. I'm not. I've lost many debates and many
Me
arguments,
too,
but I think I've done many interviews, and I don't think it would be fair to you to go back and forth. But said
No.
that, I think this is a great conversation to have. So
I share that. Now, I totally respect 100%. What I'm saying is, I approached Christianity from almost a skeptical standpoint, and I did. When I came into it, I started reading it like it was a normal book. I started going through the Old Testament, and then I went through the New Testament, and I just really tried to absorb as much as I possibly could, and then really started doing historical research and everything else.
So
So
let me ask you this.
well, let me finish.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
The reason I share that is to say, when I looked at the Quran, I approached it the same way. And I started asking a lot of questions. The reason you and I are having this question today is, or having this conversation, is because I asked questions. I sat at a coffee shop amongst many people, like different faiths, different views, and I had a lot of questions. I had no idea what to know. So when you ask something like, is it a true Christian or is it a true Muslim? That to me was like a foreign concept when I first became a believer in Christ. So what I try to do is try to sort things out: ultimate truth, authority, canonization, all these wonderful things that people love to debate about, right? Well, those were my questions as well. And so I hashed them out. I left them open. I said, please, let's really work through this just like you and I are today. So I sat with Muslims. I sat with them, and I've asked them many hard questions, and they asked me many hard questions. And the one thing that I really wrestle with amongst Muslims, when we say, oh, but you're not of the true faith and you are, and how are you to tell me that I'm not an extremist and you aren't? You're conservative, I'm liberal. That's a bunch of hogwash. I want to look at it for what it is, right? And a lot like what you're doing with me today is you're putting me on trial, right? In a way. We're having a debate, but you want to put me on trial. You want to say, hey, Jer, how are you going to tell me, the God of this world, who is loving and supposedly has everything together, we look at it for what it is, and there's chaos. You look out there, man, and it's craziness. And so I had those same questions for the Muslims. I said, hey, bro, how in the world do you see your faith playing out in the world? I'm watching call me a simpleton, call me what you want. I am not a scholar in this subject matter. I just purely I consult Google, okay, for a lot of things that I do in life. And I'm looking it up, and I'm not seeing Christians beheading people right now. Now people go, well, Jeremy, what about the Crusades? That's another conversation. What I'm seeing right now is this is what's playing out. These are the things that are occurring. What say you? And so when you say, like, well, what is the true play out of our faith? I don't know if you're familiar with Francis Schaeffer's work or Ravi Zacharias. These people I respect tremendously.
I've never even heard of those guys.
That's awesome. You should look them up. They're amazing. But Ravi Zacharias is probably one of the world's most renowned apologists in terms of the Christian faith. And when you look at what he said this one thing that really compelled me. What are the consequences of thought, or what are the implications of belief? And so when you see these things played out, I had to wrestle with the idea and concept that I don't see Christians commanded in the scriptures to have this sort of, there's not an aggressive approach. When Jesus shared the gospel, he was like, yeah, love your neighbor as you love yourself, and love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, right? But when I see the Quranic teachings, right, I'm looking at the Quranic teachings and I compare and contrast. It's by force that they are trying to insert themselves to install the Islamic nation according to their governmental systems as a theocratic nation that's governed by Allah. And I'm like, great. Yeah, there's some similar distinctions, but I'm like, the methodology that you take, the approach that you take seems to be a bit different. So you can name the name of Christ and do many horrendous things, right? We see that throughout history. People like constantly saying, well, what's different between the Christians and the Muslims? And then we look at the Muslims, and I'm saying there are many people who have named the name of Christ and were not Christians and have done completely heinous things. And I can make a very clear statement, a very clear case today as to why they wouldn't be called Christians, even though they named themselves as. And I can make a clear statement to say, if Islam was taken to its orthodoxy, right? That and I think that's what you're asking, is if Islam was taken to its complete orthodoxy, the outcomes are what we see in ISIS and others, not just ISIS itself, but it's not limited to that. So I
Um,
apologize.
no, you're fine. There's a couple things there. I'm not concerned about what is true Islam and what isn't true Islam. Just like my concern in this statement, at least for this particular topic, isn't what's true Christianity, what isn't true Christianity. My point being, the people you mentioned who've done horrible things in the name of Christianity, they would consider themselves true Christians.
Mm-hmm.
You would consider yourself a true Christian. You two would have very different stances on what Christianity means or what Jesus commanded or what the Bible teaches.
Right.
They would justify doing, not allowing women to speak in public by using Paul's epistles, for example. But you would disagree with that, and you could justify that using scripture. So I'm saying, as a skeptic or as someone who's hearing both sides of the story, I'm not going to believe any of you because you both are using the same book. Same with Islam. You have ISIS who can use the Quran to justify what they're doing, and you also have other Muslims who are peaceful, who want to make society a better place, and they can use the Quran to justify that. So it's not so much what's the true Christianity, what's not. It's the same. It's the issue of we can't know just by using your holy book or their holy book, because you both can quote it to justify your position. So how then do we decide, me who's standing on the outside, you both are making these claims using the same book to justify it? Does that make sense?
Sure. I'm going to have to disagree with you. We don't use the same book and we don't have the same terms. So you and I use something called the English language, right? So when we have to say, how do we define terms? The terms of the way Islam would define, no, wait.
Okay, sorry, go ahead. I think you may have misunderstood me, but go ahead.
I think orthodoxy is an important thing. Why are there so many denominations amongst Christianity, right? Because everyone argues about different points, right? Whether they be primary, secondary, or beyond. So I do think orthodoxy is an important thing to discuss, right? So if we take Christianity to its end, I think that's it. I don't think that we need to have a further discussion about how it's different from Islam. And the same thing be true for them. And actually, beyond that, let's talk about other beliefs like atheism. See, people say, well, atheism is not a belief. It sure is, because there are other claims that say that there is a God, and that if you are an atheist, you believe that there isn't. And so you take atheism and how did that play out, and you take every other world religion and how does those play out. You must take them to their orthodoxy. And so what I think we need to be honest about is, what are the Christian teachings? What are their definitions? What does Islam say? What are their teachings and what are their definitions? We are two distinct, different belief systems, although they may take certain viewpoints, certain names, and certain types from the views of Christianity or Judaism, which they have their roots predominantly in Judaism, not Christianity. And so when you look back at that and you say, well, what's the real debate? Hey, Jews, are you not considered brothers of Muslims, right? Because you guys almost have the same. Last time I remember, one of the holiest sites of Islam was Israel. And if I know my history correctly, it used to be number one until they decided to boot Muhammad out, because he came to proclaim, hey, I'm the Messiah, I'm the chosen one, I'm the prophet, right? To declare to you the truth, and I'm here to bring you into the truth. And they're like, no, bro, you're a false prophet. I'm sorry, I used the California term, bro.
It's okay. Oh, I lost your volume there. I can't hear you. Did you come unplugged?
I mute myself. So you're
so
you're out. So we're going to boot you out. And so then he decides that that's not the first holiest site of Islam anymore. Now Mecca and Medina are, and then Jerusalem's number 3, because you guys missed out on the Messiah's coming. So when I say why is it important to define terms? It's incredibly important. We feel that, especially amongst let me say it. Let me take religion completely out. Let me take faith. when we define terms, it's really important. We go to school, we learn one thing essential, right? Context, definition of terms. We want to know how the information is being revealed and how it's being shared. And so we examine those things as people. We're heavily skeptical. Even the Bereans, according to scripture, were skeptical of Paul, right? Because they decided to search things out before they believed on him to see if it was true. So we need to.
I don't want you to think I was comparing Islam and Christianity, saying they're of the same. I think my point was a little lost.
You said they shared the same book.
No. What I meant was, and that's maybe communication on my part. What I meant was, you have a Christian who says women should not speak in public, and they quote Paul's epistles. And you have a Christian like you, who I assume is okay with women speaking at church or in public, and you also would quote the scripture. So I was comparing two different types of Christians, I guess, as opposed to a Muslim. So that's my fault, probably, for missing. But my point being, you have Christians who have two, and I would say not allowing women to speak in church to me would seem unethical, and I'm sure you would agree that's probably not an okay thing to do. But the people who do that, and those churches exist today in 2015, who would not allow women to speak, their husbands have to speak for them, would use Paul's epistles to justify that.
Sure. Is it fair to say that you probably use things in your life to justify opinions that you shouldn't? So I do that with my wife all the time, right? I'm just being real. So I think that what's fair to say is that when I look at Paul, so if you want to use the example of speaking in public, it wasn't speaking in public, it was actually teaching. And so when you look at teaching, why is it important? Which is a totally side topic, but why was it important? And why would people say that? Why would there be an issue with that? Why would Paul take time inking up something with very limited resources that clear? Like, hey guys, why are there women teaching in your church? There shouldn't be, right? It's not that they don't want women speaking in public. It's not that the man has to speak for their wife. Trust me, wives do plenty of that on their own. The fact of the matter is, our Western culture and the way we understand the way the early Christian church was, how Paul was addressing the Corinthians and the Ephesians and all the others, right, is there were specific issues happening within inside those churches. But also, I would like you to take note that many of the people, and Christ, Jesus was crazy, right, back in the time. Many women became believers first. As a matter of fact, the woman at the well was a Samaritan woman, right? And he noted her for her faith because she went back into the city, brought all the city out and said, wow, woman, we heard what you had to say, but now we believe for him ourselves. And I think that's a very powerful message for people who don't understand cross-cultural differences. Samaritans were hated by the Jews. Okay. And for a woman who was going to the well at midday, who was considered to be a prostitute, right? The disciples even questioned why Jesus was even talking to her. And then he says, hey, no, you're right, woman. You don't have a husband. You have 5. And the one that you're with now is not your husband. So he's like, oh, oops. You discovered me. You found me out. The idea is she went back and said, hey, guys, this man has told me all the things that I've ever done, because we don't know what kind of dialogue happened between them. But the fact is, the emphasis was put on, he was talking to a Samaritan woman at the well. He was specifically doing it while the disciples were not with him, so they questioned him even. And I think the Bible's very honest about that. And then when she goes, even the city at first, like, oh man, we have a hard time that you're an outcast, because she was going to the well in midday. We know that. And she comes back and says, hey, woman, you shared with us, and now we heard what you had to say, but we believe ourselves. And they were all Samaritans. So I think that beyond just, understanding, was Jesus breaking down cultural boundaries? He was. And when Paul says something like women shouldn't speak, he wasn't saying women shouldn't speak in public. There was a specific reason he was addressing women, teaching women, and men teaching men. There's a reason for that. There's an order. So
and you don't have to convince me, honestly.
Sure.
I'm not even convinced.
That's a totally off topic from
I'm not even convinced Paul wrote that personally. I don't think First Timothy is one of Paul's authentic epistles, but that's a whole nother discussion.
Sure.
My point, I guess, being the same with my point being, compare that to the two types of characteristics of Islam we're talking about. The peaceful Islam can quote the Quran and say, oh, well, the Quran doesn't really mean that. It says this. And then the other, ISIS, or the crazy radical Islams, the sociopaths in that religion, who say, well, it tells us to do this. And in essence, I'm saying and we can wrap this up here, this part of our discussion up.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. But my point being, I can see no way to distinguish. It's the same argument. Christians are saying, well, they aren't real Christians because when the Bible says this, it also says this. It's literally the same argument Muslims are using to justify their peaceful acts of their religion and saying they're not real Muslims. And I'm not saying I'm here to decide what's a real Christian and what's a real Muslim. I'm not.
Right.
But the Bible and the Quran both have the issue of it's not very well communicated because everybody who reads it literally gets a different answer out of it.
And see, I would have to strongly disagree. The reason why I say I strongly disagree is when again, having taken that outside perspective and just looking in, having not a lot of exposure to these things, what I would suggest to you is let's look at the vehicle by which their message is delivered. Okay. Just look at the vehicle. What you have is clearly in Luke Acts compilation, right? You see to Theophilus, hey, here guys, here's what happened, because there's a big blow up, and Romans were really concerned why Jews were in such an uproar at the time, and what was really happening. Why is there such civil unrest inside Israel, and why is this message being spoken about? And Christianity, as we need to think of it, was a very new idea, a new concept. And in some cases, what we would consider an illegal religion in Rome because it wasn't certified yet, right? And so here's a lot of Paul coming in and making a defense, but Luke does an excellent job. He says, look, here's the gospel as it stands. Here's the way it's been set into place. Here's the way it's been instructed to carry out. Here's how it started in the early church, and here's how it's proceeded. Versus when we look at the Quran, we say, okay, what's the vehicle by which you deliver your message of peace? Okay, if that's what we want to call it. It probably was much similar to the way Roman delivered their Pax Romana, right? They conquered, they took over, and it created peace because you either submitted to their authority, right? Because their whole goal of their governing was, I'm going to cause you to submit to our authority. And at least Rome was like, hey, you could worship your own thing as long as you pay us taxes, right? Because they were open to many different gods. But when you look at what Islam is doing, it's no different, in my opinion, from Rome, because you just need to take a look at its early history, the way it's progressed, and the vehicle by which it's delivered. So when I look at the vehicle of Islam and how it delivers its so-called message of peace, I have a real rub with in terms of Christianity and how it delivers its message. There's a stark difference. Let me share. The stark difference is, hey, brother, Jesus died for your sins, right? And then it's not up to you that you can't do it on your own. It's impossible. That he's done it for you, and that because of that work, as long as you believe on it, which takes incredible humility, right? That I've now embraced this belief in this truth, and then I move on. Whereas Islam is like, you either believe or you die, or you believe or you submit, you believe or this. And I don't care what peaceful group wants to say, hey, no, it's really a religion of peace. Oh, really? I'm looking at the vehicle by which you deliver your peaceful message, and I don't see that ever. Not ever once. I'm still trying to find an example of where peace comes from. How is the result of what you're sharing? Where is the hope in what you're sharing? Until total dominance occurs, then there will be peace. Well, of course, then nobody's going to argue with you, right? I mean, that's the only way I can see it. I can't see it any other way.
And don't get me wrong, I don't disagree. The Quran is full of horrible things and horrible commandments. I'm not, and I think if you follow the Quran as much as possible to the T, then yeah, you're going to do some pretty horrendous things.
That's right.
So, I don't want to dominate our conversation here. Do you have any questions for an atheist? You ever wanted to ask an atheist?
Are you an atheist?
I am an atheist.
Why?
Because I am unconvinced of any God claim I've yet to hear.
You just need to be convinced.
I would be willing to be convinced if sufficient evidence was given, but as in so far, every time someone's given a claim or brought up an argument for a God, it's been unconvincing to me.
Got it. So and let me first by say, like, wow, I'm more impressed every moment I talk to you. The reason why is I have yet to find someone who is as honest. There's the thought and concept that there's no such thing as an atheist. Have you ever heard of that before?
I have.
Right. So what do you think of
Obviously,
that?
it depends how you use it. I'm assuming if you're using it in the context, which I think you're using it, as in
Sure.
where Paul says, everyone knows in their heart there's God, pretty much.
Romans, right?
Yeah.
The book of Romans. Yeah. Okay.
I would disagree with that because I'm fairly certain I know what I think better than anyone else knows what I think, and I'm fairly certain I have no belief in a God.
Okay.
I'm just.
Okay.
Do you?
Fair enough.
I mean,
fair enough. No.
What are your thoughts? Do you think there are actual? How do you define atheism? And let me see if we're on the same page, because atheism is a very loaded term.
Atheism in its simplest form is atheism, which is there is no God or gods, right? So no gods or without. The actual direct translation in the Greek, from what I understand, is without gods. And it was an idea that came from when the civilization at the time was looking at the word skepticism comes from that period, right? And so when you look at what is skepticism, it's just questioning. It's like we see all these things around us and there's thousands of gods, and oh man, it seems to be incredibly confusing. We look at the outcome of these things and it doesn't always seem good. It seems great. The way we have chosen to define God or gods is by either our interaction with them, the way we observe them, right? I mean, Athens at the time of Paul, when he walked in, they even had a statue to the unknown God because there were so many. They wanted to make sure they had everyone covered. And so they didn't want to offend any God. So just in case we didn't know of one, here's one. And so I think that they were right, honestly, in that period of time to say, man, like everything that we see happening right now, just by observation, we have a hard time believing in such things. And I think that has to do a lot with man has made God in their own image, right? So Paul makes this argument. And by the way, let's talk about the book of Romans real quick.
Sure.
Just because you brought it up, the book of Romans is probably one of the most airtight arguments in existence, so much to the point today that law schools study it in terms of rhetoric, not just because of theological perspectives, but they look at it for rhetoric alone. Like, wow, look how potent this argument is. It's really hard to come against Paul and what he's saying in the book of Romans. And so if you look at what he's delivering, he goes, man, look, guys, you have said there is no God. Right. And by logic, we want to talk on an intellectual level. You can't say that. You cannot say that. The reason why it's not fair for you to say that, and to be more proper, you probably be agnostic. You just don't know. And the reason it's not fair to say that is because in order to make that statement, what you're saying is you're appealing to subjectivity, right? I have experienced certain things. I have looked at the world in a certain way. I have a knowledge base that I appeal to. I am looking at knowledge a certain way. Knowledge applied is considered wisdom. And based on that wisdom that I have, as I'm sorting through this, I cannot reconcile a God in existence. Is that fair to say that that's what you're saying?
I would accept the term agnostic from an academic setting.
Right.
And I had in a previous interview I did with a philosopher, he made a very valid point, which I think which I would agree with him. He was a Christian philosopher. That the term atheist in 2015 is not used how it would be used in academia.
Right.
I would say, yeah. But for generally, when people say atheist in this community, in the atheist skeptic community, they would probably refer to themselves as strong agnostic.
Right. Okay.
I am unconvinced a God exists, and more than likely one does not exist. Right. I personally would not say there is no God, because I don't like making an absolute statement.
Yeah. Well, that's really unfair to say. Yeah, it's unfair to say, because when you look at it and we're trying to take an intellectual and logical, rational approach to this. We say, man, I must make myself really to have the attributes of the God of the Bible in order to prove otherwise. And what I mean by that is, as I look at it, I'm like, man, based on my subjective individual perspective, which is inductive, not deductive. It's impossible to say it's completely deductive. I'm looking at it from a small particular, and I'm trying to define the whole by the particulars. And so that is the greatest fallacy. You cannot say there is none, because what we're going to command is that you prove otherwise, right? It's the same
Mhm.
thing that many would say, hey, Christians, prove there is. We would say, prove there isn't. And so an agnostic position is far more safe intellectually, because we don't quite know. You haven't been convinced enough that there is, and being that you are, I think that you are safer in that place intellectually and rationally, but you are not safe from what God has claimed himself to be. And so when you look at atheism at large, many say almost, and I had a guy today say to me, it's so hard, man, share with your people, bro, that he said, believing in what you believe in is the same equivalent to believing in what Dr. Seuss wrote and holding it for eternity. And I'm like, wow, really? It's hard for me to resolve such things, to say I don't think, I'm not intellectual. I haven't searched these things out to see if they be true. The evidences haven't presented enough for me to believe in such. And what Paul would argue in the book of Romans is that the evidence is so clear. And in the Greek, it's really specific, like, hey, you're without excuse. You've been left without excuse because creation itself reveals structure, reveals ordinance, reveals a groundwork that would suggest, who was it that described the unmoved mover? Was it Aristotle? I can't remember. Anyway, the point being is there's something outside of existence that we know it, that has pushed it into existence or created or made it happen, and that we must at some point resolve based on what we see observably, that it's so that the extent is you are left without an excuse, that there is one.
But
So
when Paul wrote that, we didn't have astrophysics, we didn't have biology, we didn't have all these things. And
right.
just for sake of
Sure.
conversation, that is one of the, I think, genuine Pauline epistles. I accept Romans is actually written by Paul. So,
Yeah. Okay. Well,
um,
to be fair as well, astrophysics can't answer the why question. So I think it's
no,
important. Yeah.
but it can answer the, or
The
let me
cause.
let me rephrase that. It
Yes.
can give evidence to the how question. And when Paul says you're without excuse because look at nature, whenever we look at nature, it's almost a God of the gaps argument. We used to think rainbows were caused by God's blessing. We used to think earthquakes were caused by a God is angry.
Right.
And the more we learn about the universe and this reality which we must interact in, the less we find out a God is doing it, whatever that God is. And
That's
now we're to the
supposing that God
point,
was actually a part of creation and not independent from creation. So I think
but
it's important to
now
make that distinction.
we're to the very beginning of the universe, the Big Bang. And
Right.
I don't know if you're a creationist. That's a question I can ask you later. But let's
Sure.
assume, for sake of argument, just for
Sure.
the sake of argument, we both accept the Big Bang. Okay.
Yes.
Now we're
Okay.
science is here at the Big Bang. We're at the very beginning of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
But before that, there was God.
Mm-hmm.
Do you understand? It seems like the more we learn, well, God isn't here. He's here. He's here. He's the goalpost is moving. So that
Is it
also,
moving though? Is it moving? I can go back to the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, right? And it hasn't changed. So the Jews have carried this through oral tradition, written tradition for thousands of years, that a God who was separate from creation, right? He has described himself distinctly as separate from creation, who spoke it into existence. And so I can't really say that, I can't appeal to the same thing you're saying. Like, I think there's very clear claims that need to be given credence, whether you agree with it or not. The claim that God is independent from his creation, that he created it, he spoke it into existence, he created it in a period of time, and how he went ahead and operated it, we need to make sure that remains intact, because that is a necessary, essential part to the rest of the story, if you will.
just curious, can I answer the question? Are you, would you consider yourself a creationist?
Sure.
Like Answers in Genesis creationist? Is that a fair?
What does that mean?
Are you familiar with Answers in Genesis?
No.
Oh,
I have
thank
no
goodness.
idea what that is.
Really? Ken
Yeah.
Ham, and the Creation Museum type people?
No, I don't know. Yeah.
Oh,
I'm
great.
sorry, I don't get around
No,
much.
you're
I'm a
fine.
father of 4 children, man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you? How old do you think the Earth is?
I believe it is exactly what it says in the Bible. So I'm a literalist. I would
Which
say
is what I
it was
6,000.
created. It was created in 6 days, and it is
Okay.
as old as it says it is. Yeah. The reason why I have to be that way, and feel free to make fun of me as much as you want. The
No, you're
reason
fine.
I have to, I have to be that way, and I have to think that way because, again, the honest approach. Like when I started reading the Bible in Genesis, I started there. I had no idea. I'm like, what in the world is this all? Who is this Jesus character anyway? I probably should know the backstory, right? And so I started reading Genesis. I'm like, holy moly, God created this in 6 days and rested on the seventh. And those are a literal 6 days. Well, yeah, when you look at the Hebrew, it says literal. There's no other way to think of it differently. So
I would
as
agree.
goofy as it may sound, I have to be as honest with the text as I can and go, man, okay, I believe God can do that. If he spoke anything into existence, dude's probably got it where he could make everything in 6 days, right? And so I know that sounds pretty ridiculous, but there are some things that you have to appeal to. And the reason I say I have to is, and I'm required to, according to when I look at orthodoxy of the text, is that is exactly what the Jews believed. And that is exactly what they held to. They carried those traditions on for years, spent.
But the Jews don't believe Jesus is the Messiah, and you accept that.
Because the Bible said they wouldn't, and many don't. And if you want to quote the book of Romans, it says there are always a remnant according to the election of grace. So if you look at, because you know what? It's funny you say that. Elijah had the same argument. He was like, man, Lord, I'm preaching here. I'm letting everybody know. And no one loves me. Everybody hates me. They're kicking me out of here. And he's like, listen, Elijah, people hear you. It's just they're not the majority. They're the minority, and they're also being they're troubled the same way you are. They're having the same problem. He made it. God made a promise. He said, as long as the sun rises and sets, that there will always be a remnant according to the election of grace in Israel. That is actually his guaranteed promise that he would be God. The fact that that little nation still is in existence, and if you look at secular maps, just secular maps, and go, wow, that little speck of dirt has been around causing trouble for quite some time, right? During the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and on. How has that little speck of dirt remained? The fact is because it's remained, he said, look, that's how you know I am. So the evidences show, because Israel's still even in existence, that shows he exists. And the fact that he has allowed them to go into captivity, come back, go in captivity, come back. Millions of Jews have been persecuted over history. Millions have been killed. That little speck of dirt has been tried to wipe off the map multiple times. And we look at it and say, wow, wait a minute. How come? I think the better question is, why is it not? Right? And so why is it not missing? Why is Israel not done by now?
Well, I would say we can go into that, but
Sure.
one of the reasons is because I think people have purposely wanted to revitalize it, bring it back, protect it.
Are you sure?
I would think the United States of America had a pretty big hand for religious reasons to make sure Israel was a sovereign nation again.
But what about before? I mean, the fact, so
because they were a scattered group of people before. Right. I mean, they didn't have a nation for how many hundreds of years, thousands of years.
Did you know they're the only nation in history to ever lose its sovereignty, regain it, and regain their original language?
Well, I don't know if they ever lost their original language. Their original Hebrew language, very, very traditional for them. But again,
so look at real quick. That's an important fact. I think it's important. No, I'm sharing that not to.
I would have to look into that. I have not heard. I assume the rabbis have always been very knowledgeable in Hebrew to read, because they're very picky about reading the Torah in Hebrew.
You're right. But you're right. No, you're right. 100% with the religious leaders. I'm talking about a nation as a whole with the Hebrew language, speaking it in common tongue. The fact that if you know about the language at all, it's vowel signs and symbols that were put on top were used as a form to re-educate their people on how to speak it. It's astounding that nation even exists. To me, it's evidence of a direct miracle. When you want to say, hey, how we haven't seen any miracles, I'm like, oh man, consider Israel, bro. Like, just look at it for.
But again, we can explain Israel through natural phenomena, natural causes. But I didn't want to go. I'm not an expert on the history of Israel at all.
I say I say I'm not either. But I would say that, to answer the point, I know you're not, but and again, neither am I. But from again a simpleton view, just looking at it and saying, if that was God's promise, and they haven't been annihilated from if you take a brief look right now with the current, aside from America's protection, which that can be debated as well, especially under the current, regime that we have here. Yes, I did refer to them as a regime. But the fact of the matter is if you look at it, just being honest, like just saying, man, wow, wait a second, for a brief moment, how in the world does Israel still exist? They're surrounded by enemies constantly who are fully capable of wiping them off the planet. And that has happened since their inception. Why? Is because if you can wipe out Israel, then you can wipe out God's ultimate promise, which was to sustain them to the end. And so I look at them as, it's not hard for me to go, wow, God, that's a miracle in itself. That's one huge one. And so I have to appeal to that because it's a promise.
But I think, again, you could say, well, that's a fulfilled prophecy. I'm not going to debate whether that is, but whatever. That's ignoring the other
prophecy. It was a promise.
Well, that's ignoring, well, we could call it promise. That's ignoring the other promises or prophecies the Bible has not kept or
unfulfilled.
Yes. And we're ignoring those and say, well, look at this one. It's counting the hits, ignoring the misses, I think.
Or unless you say, well, 98% has been fulfilled, and the one that he has yet to return is Christ himself. So when you say, when the majority of those prophecies, it's easy for me to look at what hasn't been fulfilled, but it's really hard for me to deny what has. Even in the life of Christ himself, the fact that they did even come to pass the way that they did, according to the way they did, and the time they did, is just astounding mathematically, just to consider itself. So it's hard for me to go, yeah, I'm going to argue from the point of I don't know when they're coming, but let's talk about that real quick. The book of Hebrews addresses that. We would say the author, we don't know, but we don't know. The fact is that he says clearly that they had faith in the things to hope for, having not yet received the promises to come, right? But by faith, and it goes through a huge list of things that they were doing by faith, not having seen, because they look forward to the promise. And then when the promise came, which was the gospel message of Christ, he came, he delivered, things happened, and now they look forward. So we look back on that. And what do we hope for? What is the expectation of Christianity as a whole? The fact that Jesus resurrected from the dead, appeared to many for 40 days, right? And that he said himself, I'm coming back. That's what we look forward to. That's the great expectation.
Do you want to talk about Jesus for a couple seconds?
Let's do it, man.
Sure. What convinces you Jesus was the Messiah? I'm assuming you believe Jesus is God, not just a son of God or demigod, but you believe Jesus is God. You're a Christian in America. That's a fair assumption. You'd be surprised
that believe that too, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, you'd be surprised. Some of the people I have to clarify that. Sometimes some people I come across would say no to that. What convinces you Jesus died and rose again? I can't hear you. I think you came unplugged again. It's okay. There you go.
Myself.
I can. All right, go ahead.
I apologize. So what convinces me that Jesus died and rose again from the dead?
Sure.
Okay. So number one, his gospel accounts, I think, are some of the most compelling evidences. And why do I say that? So if you look at the life of the disciples previous to his actual crucifixion, okay, they had an expectation of he would be a political leader, a military type leader, that he was going to overthrow the government of Rome. So if we look back, let's hit the pause button there and reverse back just a little bit. Are you familiar with the term great expectation?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So Israel at that time had expected, they went around a 300 to 400 year period of silence where they didn't hear from God. The last prophets died off. The Maccabean family and all the rulers of those periods of times where we get the idea of the menorah and everything else were at large ruling those times. And then you get to this place where Herod was a leader, and he had a concern. Well, what was his concern? Why would he be concerned about his authority by some child, right? Why would he have a need to decree killing children? Because he was worried about the Messiah coming. Why would we have the reason being is when Rome had overthrown the sovereign rule of Israel, there were clear prophecies that said that at this time you can expect the Messiah to return, because when Israel had no longer the ability to govern itself, without going into all the scriptures, they had expected the Messiah to return. They were in a period of silence and waiting for this to happen. And so when you have John the Baptist come along, right, Jesus's cousin, he was declaring those things, right?
Let me ask you this. do you think the Gospels were eyewitness accounts, or who do you think wrote the Gospels? We're talking just the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and
Three
John.
three of the Gospels were eyewitness accounts. Luke says himself that he actually interviewed the witnesses.
Where does he say that at? Luke was the traditional Luke was supposedly a a physician who was a
Yes.
disciple of Paul. I
Right.
don't I don't think Mark ever claims to be an eyewitness account. Neither does Matthew, and for that matter, neither does John. And if, I
I have
would
to answer that off another question, but yeah.
it's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So
I'm looking
I
it up
would
right now. Yeah.
be skeptical that in I don't know any scholar, there could be some out there, but the majority of scholars would say the Gospels were not eyewitness accounts. In fact, a good date I would say for Mark is 68 AD, and I would consider that the earliest.
Okay.
So so that's why I ask is I would consider the Gospels hearsay, secondhand accounts, and you're viewing them from eyewitness accounts, and those are two different burdens of proof.
I mean, when you're reading them, so I honestly, I haven't actually gone through them extensively,
That's
believe
fine,
it or
and
not.
I'm not trying to say,
I
"Ah,
spent
gotcha."
I spent more time. No, no, that's fair. That's actually a really good question. I spent more time in the Old Testament than I have in the New because I really wanted to understand what was the need of the Messiah. And so, why do we look at the Messiah? Who is he? Why was there an expectation? What did people see a need for the Messiah? And when you look at that, because it's a really unique term, it's a really unique idea. Why would someone die for my sins? What is that? That didn't make sense to me. And so when you ask the question, do you believe in a Messiah? Right. I do. And going into the first accounts and who saw what and when, I actually personally haven't read through through them as complete enough to know to say
Yeah,
yes. I've done a complete study on them. I've really sorted it out, and I'm looking at it from your perspective, saying, oh, were those for eyewitness accounts? You know, when I read them, and a couple of them, to be quite honest, have been some time, but I've spent more time in Luke Acts because I wanted to know more about why the church, right? And so how the church happened, canonization of the Bible, you know, where did we get the idea and the concept of Bible? What am I reading today? Because I wanted to know more about it. So to ask that question, I, I know I would have to go back through the Gospels again to give a fair answer to that. But from my understanding, as of reading them, those were so. Matthew was a disciple, right? He was the tax collector. John was the beloved disciple. So those two were eyewitness accounts. Wait,
go
I'm just
ahead.
saying out of my reading.
Go ahead.
So when I look at those two, I'm like, yeah, those were both called out. Those two personally made specific references. I haven't spent a lot of time in the Gospel of Mark, to be quite honest, but I know for a fact that Luke was dealing with. He says these. I'm trying to give an account, Theophilus, on these things that I have interviewed, seen myself, known of people who have those firsthand accounts, and I'm giving you a direct. So it is fair to say, yes, it is a hearsay, but let me address the person of Jesus real quick, according to your original question.
Sure.
Why do I believe in the death and resurrection? Why am I seeing? It's hard for me because it's like you look at it and you say, originally I looked at the disciples and the way he responded. You had the great expectation. John the Baptist came. They were asking John the Baptist if he was the Messiah. We know, according to secular history, that these people had caused quite a ruckus. So if you look at the life of Jesus himself, Josephus and other secular historians would say, hey, this guy caused a ruckus, right? There was an actual person here. He actually had a lot to say, and he created some problems inside Israel. I'm apologize for the ridiculous paraphrasing, but
It's
I,
okay.
this is from my limited memory of reading these long time ago. I mean, it was like 8 years ago that I studied this particular topic. But then when you look at, I think more compelling is let's look at who they were as humans and their human response to the crucifixion of Jesus, right? So they had expected him to be a military leader and a political leader to overthrow the Roman government and to bring sovereignty back to the government, that God would rule the nation once more of Israel. And so when they looked at him, they're like, yes, we see signs and wonders. We see all these amazing things. His teaching is a little ridiculous sometimes, but we appeal to what he's saying. And we really want to see this thing go through to the point where, I mean, and being honest with the Bible, if you really look at it for what it says, there were people arguing, hey, Jesus, who's going to be your right hand and your left? He's like, what? right? He didn't say that, but the fact is, like, his response was what? Like, hey, that's up to the Father, not up to me. And you're asking that because of your limited understanding. And to the point, he says to who we regard as one of the greatest apostles, Peter, he says, "Get behind me, Satan," right? You have no idea. You're missing the whole point. You are stopping. He said, "Far be it from you, Lord, that you would go, that you would die." What do you mean you're going to die? We're expecting you. We're expecting you to take over. That he even chopped the dude's ear off, and it said he healed him. He said, "Put your sword away," right? And so, yeah, you want to take all those accounts and say, "I don't know about those," but what I want to do is compile them into the humanity of those men, those people who were around him. And I say, okay, if I was one of those disciples at the time, how would I have responded? Just like they did. Peter denied him 3 times, right? And they fled. They had no reason whatsoever to believe that a resurrection happened. And then they want to make up the story about how they stole the body or he swooned, wasn't quite dead. No, those Romans were really good at killing people. And they put him as a spectacle in front of people. They jabbed him in the side, made sure that he was good and dead. They pulled him off of that tree. They put him into a tomb. Joseph offered his family's tomb, right, for him. And that is those are people who are recorded in history. And you say, wait a minute, why would those, do you know how many of the apostles died for their faith?
We don't know. I know what Christian tradition says hundreds of years afterwards, but
well, there were firsthand accounts of the apostles who had died at serious deaths. Peter himself was crucified, right?
I would say there's firsthand accounts of James and Peter, and I would accept John historically existed. I wouldn't.
Let's say, but let's just do the ones you agree with. Okay, sure. Let's just talk about those. Would you be willing to die for a lie?
Probably not.
Right. So if you knew Jesus himself and he was like, "Bro, we got this, right? Here, I got a lot of stuff to talk to you about. I'm gonna show you some signs and wonders, and at the end of it, I'm gonna die." And you're like, "No, bro, don't go." And so he dies, right? And then these guys are like, dude, he literally is recorded for denying him because he was fearful for his life. They had fled. And afterwards it says, wait a minute, they saw him again. So if he did not resurrect from the dead and appear to many, it says for 40 days he taught. He was in people's homes and he appeared to many over the course of 40 days. And if you look really close at what the scriptures say, it says others resurrected with him. Other saints literally resurrected with him. I don't know how to.
Yeah, that's a very interesting passage.
I know. I'm not going into that right now, but I'm saying like there was some wild stuff that happened historically enough for secular people to go, wait a minute, there's something that we need to look in. And more importantly, I want to look at the life of apostles. The apostles changed. There was something that clearly changed in those people enough for that they would, whether we know accounts or not, they were willing to die for that. And so when we look at that and go, wow, how is this message permeated throughout history? How is this message one of the widely distributed and the most distributed in history? It's the most printed in history, right? And there are more evidential documents for firsthand, secondhand, from the 100 and below to 100 and 200 and on, to go, why was this so, why would a lie? Why would someone who I just can't reconcile that.
Because it wasn't a lie. And let me back up here. There's a lot there to unpack there that you said. First, I would encourage you to find me in any of the 4 gospels where it assigns authorship, where they even make a claim to be an eyewitness. I would start there. Okay. My issues with the gospels are, like you mentioned, in Matthew, where it talks about the dead saints coming back to life. That time in Roman history, there were people literally in Israel writing things down, and no one happened to notice. Did people walking around know historians whose job, Josephus, whose job was to write about the Jews during that time period, never noticed dead people walking around Israel? For that matter, Josephus. I mean,
it's hard to say with Josephus. It's not that he would have seen them, but it's hard to.
But someone would have noticed them. But for that matter, Josephus
wrote about them, and it's what we have. So I mean, it's
no one wrote none of the even other gospels mentioned dead people coming out of the graves except Matthew. That's a pretty huge deal. But no one else notices it. But a little tiny sentence in Matthew. But again, for that matter, issues with the gospels, I would say, you mentioned Herod and the killing of the innocents.
Right.
Matthew is the only one who mentions that. Again, that's a huge deal. No other historian whose people wrote about Herod whose job was to write about Herod, write bad stuff. Josephus hated Herod, and he left that out. Luke could not have had the, and I'm not trying to beat you up over the gospel, because I'm just saying,
beat me up as much as you want. I don't care.
Luke could not have had the murder of the innocents, because in Luke, Herod was long dead by the time Jesus was born. Luke makes that very clear. Luke had Jesus born during the reign of Quirinius, which happened 20 to 30 years after Herod was dead, not even in power, but dead. And Herod died like 5 years after he lost power. So there's a discrepancy of Luke could not have had Herod kill innocent babies when Jesus was born, because Herod was long dead in Luke's gospel. And so that tells me they have a narrative to tell. They're trying to tell a specific story. Luke was trying to get Jesus in this specific place at this specific time.
Okay.
Mark doesn't even have a birth. Jesus becomes the Son of God once he's baptized by John the Baptist, which is a whole nother crazy issue, because I think Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist caused a big issue with his early followers. And I'm not...
There actually was a dispute among them, and they're clear about that.
Correct.
Like, hey, I thought you were the Messiah, are you not? And even the Pharisees and Sadducees were asking him the same question. So
Mark actually addresses that.
Right.
But so again, those are the issues I would start off with the Gospels. Then you mentioned, would you die for a lie? I accept Peter most likely existed. Paul claims he met Peter. Paul claims he met James. I am convinced Paul was a historical figure. So those people existed. And sure, I'll say, sure, they may have been killed for their faith. I don't know. The Bible doesn't specify. The only thing we have is Fox's Book of Martyrs, which was written hundreds of years after the supposed events. But have you heard of Jim Jones? You know who Jim Jones, the cult leader, is?
Oh, I don't know much about him, but of course.
Okay.
Don't drink.
I can show you videos right now on YouTube of people saying they seen Jim Jones raise somebody from the dead. They seen Jim Jones cure their mother of cancer.
Okay.
People killed themselves for Jim Jones. They were convinced he was their Messiah.
Did Jim Jones raise from the dead?
This was in the 80s.
But did Jim Jones raise?
No, he didn't. No. Okay. Did Jesus raise from the dead? We don't know.
Yes, he did.
But
according to
you're saying, which not according to 3 of the Gospels, he did. Then Mark doesn't actually have him having a physical resurrection. In Mark's, it's just a purely spiritual resurrection, which is again another confusing issue. Why Mark would only not have the physical resurrection. That's concerning. That should.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I'll look.
Yeah. The ending of Mark is he's dead. The women go to the temple, 2 women, and they see a man, supposedly an angel. The text doesn't specify it's an angel or not, just as a man. And he says, Jesus is not here. He has risen. He's in, heaven with your Father or whatever. And go tell, the disciples. And then it says the women run away and tell nobody because they're sorely afraid. And that's where the gospel cuts off. Boom. That's the end.
I don't wrestle with that. Let me tell you why. Just to answer that question. I
Sure.
don't wrestle with that. Are you familiar with how cartoons are made?
Sure.
Okay. So I'm an artist. I've never heard anyone use this analogy. This is mine.
Go ahead.
Feel free to shred it up. So the way I've always looked at it is, if you look at the way cartoons are made, they have a background, right? And then they have a rendering, right, of the cartoon so that they can create action and motion. Okay. And then they lay these laminates over the top of the background, right?
You're talking like old school cartoons.
Yeah, like the early Mickey Mouse and stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so forgive me for this horrible analogy. So the way I've always looked at it is the Gospels are harmonious. It's just that you have, and this is really, into my opinion, only emboldens and strengthens the.
Did you say the Gospels are harmonious?
Yes.
What if I could show you where Luke has Jesus being born 20 years after Matthew does?
Awesome. So show me. I don't see that, but I would be happy to see that. Show me. If you could do me a favor, write that to me after we're done talking. Sure. This, I'd be happy. But let me give you my example. So,
go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're good. When I read these, okay, just with an honest approach, I don't have a lot of these presuppositions that we're discussing now. Okay. I didn't know a lot of the historical evidence. I didn't know any of these things. When I was reading them and I saw them overlap, okay, what I looked at is there was a backdrop. Okay, there's a consistent message happening across the board here, and then these players were being overlapped based on people's firsthand or secondhand, right, for your experience, and they're trying to be placed in, and they can absolutely be placed into the stories. You asked me a moment ago to try to give you an account of all these things, right? And I'm like, oh man, I'm trying to wrestle through remembering. I'm having a hard time, but there are certain facts and there are certain things that are very clear to me. And so when I'm looking at the background, which are the facts, the things that are clear to me, and I'm looking at the players and how they were involved, it's not hard for me to reconcile the resurrection and go, wow, yes, some people saw some things, some people saw other things, some things were important to certain viewers, some people emphasized other things about the things, but the fact of the matter is he resurrected from the dead. And here's what I'm looking at. I have this perspective, this perspective, this perspective. It only shows the honesty and the humanity behind it going, we're just trying to be real. We were all fleeing, we were dispersed, we were running away, and now I'm struggling. And so you said a moment ago, I don't have any accounts. I just pulled it up real quick because I just read this the other day. First John so do you believe that John wrote First John? The same John that wrote the gospel.
And I can go into why, but I think the author of First John was very familiar with the Gospel of John, but the Greek is, from my understanding, from talking to scholars and interviewing scholars, the Greek is way too different, and the vocabulary is too advanced. They use language that they would not have used during John's lifetime.
Fair enough. Okay, fair enough. That's a great argument, but let's just read it for what it says.
Sure.
That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we looked upon and have touched with our hands, concerning the word of life, the Logos, right? So when you talk about the Logos, it's the same word. The life was made manifest. We've seen it. We testify to it and proclaim to you the eternal lives, which was the Father and was made manifest to us. That which we have seen and heard, we proclaim to you, so that you may have fellowship with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and with the Son, Jesus Christ. And then
let me ask you this. Oh, sorry, I thought you were finished.
For the purpose, we write these things so that your joy may be complete.
Let me ask you this. Yeah. You accept Acts is literally true, correct? The book of Acts.
Again, I was literate. I must.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Acts makes the statement that John, Peter, and some of the other disciples were illiterate fishermen.
Awesome.
So how could John have this is why I'm skeptical. I'm not saying it's proof it's not, but reason to be skeptical. And I would hope you would be skeptical too.
Sure.
When Acts tells me they're illiterate, then we have this person saying, oh, this is by John the Apostle, written in very advanced, educated Greek.
Right.
Why would a fisherman living in Galilee, a first century Jewish fisherman who is illiterate, randomly learn advanced, educated Greek?
I think it's really awesome that you say that. No, I think it's great because you know what? They responded the same way. So if you look at the boldness of Peter, right? When he was put on, he was thrown in jail. All right. So he was in jail and they're like, well, I perceive these men are not studied, right? How was that saying that they don't know anything? No. It's that they're making the same argument you are. They're saying
Peter and John knew Greek. Where did they learn it from?
Right. That's the thing. So it's the fact of the matter is it about Greek? Is it about that language? Is it about, when you look at the book of Acts clearly, they are also baffled. So when you look at it and say, wait, weren't these but fishermen? Aren't these people who are unstudied? Aren't these people who don't realize and understand? They're not studied in the law as we are. I don't know if they're talking about Greek like you are. I have to look at that again. The fact of the matter is they made the same claim you did. They said, wait a minute. How are you making such clear, concise arguments? And we know that you don't know. You haven't studied it to the degree we have. So they said the same thing.
And they're talking about the law, and the author of the book of Acts was getting that point across. My point being, they're first century Jewish fishermen living in Galilee, and they happen to know advanced Greek, not only advanced Greek, but Greek that some of the language or vocabulary didn't even exist until the 2nd century, like not the Gospel of John, but the epistles of John, or the epistles of Peter.
That's a great point. I have never researched that, but all I know is what it says is that here we look at it, and it was placed there for a reason. It says we were eyewitnesses. So,
I don't disagree that whoever wrote First John was wanting to come across as the, disciple John.
Okay.
I'm skeptical it is, because we know, and you would agree with this, there are people, we have the Gospel of Judas. I'm assuming you don't think Judas was written by Judas. We have the Gospel of Thomas. I'm assuming you agree it's not written by Thomas. We have the Gospel of Mary Magdalene I'm assuming you don't agree it's written by Mary Magdalene. We have all these forged epistles,
There's a
forged
reason
gospels.
those don't exist in the canon. They weren't
Correct. But the
even
point
accepted
being,
in the first century, and some of those came after the first century, right? And
correct.
So
but the point
it's hard
being,
for me to say the reason they're not in the canon. No, to appeal to the same logic, they're not in the canon because we can agree they're not. They shouldn't be. It's obvious. There's a reason they shouldn't be in the canon.
I would agree that they are very radical for the biblical canon. But my point being,
even accepted, and some of them were even unknown. So why would they even be included?
There was some debates among some of them and some of the count, because especially in the debates of, is Jesus God? Is he just the Son of God? Did he turn in that debate whole? And some of them were being considered, but a lot of them were Gnostic gospels, which were a big problem for early Christians.
Well, Paul addresses it often. I mean, you look through John's addressing it in John, First John, whoever wrote First John according to you, and then you look at the different epistles where that seems to be one of the key issues that they're addressing at the time, right? And so, why would they include something that they completely disagreed with and called heresy?
Well, that's my point. My point being not whether it belongs in the canon or not. My point being,
argument could be the Jewish oral laws, right? I mean, another thing. So.
But the point being, we know people put names of famous biblical characters onto the titles of gospels and epistles. So it's not uncommon or not unheard of. They could have done that for John. Okay. And we have reason to be suspect of John by the language and vocabulary that epistle uses. And the type of Jesus it talks about is such a, different type of Jesus than Mark and Matthew and Luke talk about.
It is.
I would encourage you, and we'll talk about this in a minute when we wrap up here, because we're going on an hour. In the Gospel of Mark, that Jesus is a secret Jesus. He actually says he does not come to save everybody. He only wants his select few people, probably the Jews. He doesn't specify, I'm assuming the Jews. He hates Gentiles in that gospel. He actually says, the story you gave earlier about the woman at the well, your story, I think, comes from Matthew and John. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is a jerk to that lady. He says, why should I give the food meant to the children to the dogs? When she tries to talk to Jesus, pretty much saying, your people are dogs. I'm not going to waste my time with you. He's talking about her being a Canaanite woman, which is what she is in Mark. I don't think she's a Samaritan in Mark. But the Jesus of Mark is very different from the Jesus of John. The Jesus of John is he works miracles. Mark has very few miracles, and the miracles he does, Jesus kind of screws up. Jesus actually, literally, if you read Mark, he messes up a few of his miracles and he has to do them twice.
Oh, I'm going to look.
Like he heals a blind person and he does it wrong. He screws up the blind guy's vision and he has to do it again. Oh, yeah. And I can send you those links. In fact, I'll ask you to read the Gospel of Mark. The reason being, obviously, I
apologize.
Yeah. No, you're fine.
But I just haven't.
I would encourage you.
Yeah.
Just read the Gospel of Mark as if that's the only gospel you have.
Okay.
As if you're a first century Jew living in 68, 70 AD. If that's the only access you have to Jesus, what would you learn about Jesus? How would you become saved? What was Jesus's mission on earth? Okay. And read it just in that from the lens of a first century Jew. I think you would get a very different picture of Jesus, because historically, Matthew and Luke and John, their Jesus didn't even exist yet, I would say. Their Jesus came, it's very interesting. If you read them in the order they were written, Mark first, then Matthew, then Luke, then John, see the evolution of Jesus and his abilities and what he does. Mark specifies during the trial, literally specifies Jesus was silent during his trial, completely silent. John has him talking a mile a minute. So again, that's when you say they're harmonious. To me, I disagree with that because of things like that. Mark has Jesus dying on Friday. John has him dying on Thursday. Things like that. And again, you can say, well, those aren't huge issues. But the point being that means they were serving an agenda. There's a reason John put his death on a Thursday and not on a Friday like the other Gospels, because John had needed him to fulfill being dead for 3 days. Mark never mentioned that prophecy. Mark probably didn't even know about that prophecy. John talks about it and needs him to fulfill it. Why would Mark have him die on a Friday and be dead for 2 days? Because Mark probably didn't care how long he was dead. That wasn't the point of the gospel. The point of the gospel was to talk about what is the Messiah and a suffering Messiah. So I would encourage you to just read the Gospel of Mark by itself.
I will. Can you do me a favor?
Sure.
Especially if you publish this.
Sure.
Is if you publish this, my one promise I'm going to ask you.
Sure.
And I'm going to warn you because I'm going to come back with some answers, because it happens every time. And this is not out of a trying to, I'm really not trying to defend a dogma or my particular, I don't care. I don't care enough, because I do want it to be true. And I think out of a desire to know the truth, I will search these things out, and I'm happy to. If you could please send me what you're saying. I love what you're saying, and I really appreciate it. I would like to have another meeting like this that is published that shows my results.
I'll tell you what, give me something to read and research, and let's do this again in a couple of weeks.
Be awesome. I would really appreciate that.
What do you want me to read and look into? Give me homework.
No, I don't need you to look into anything.
Okay.
I really don't. I'm actually fully convinced. I really am. I'm convinced that the things that have happened, right? And this is where I'm going to appeal to the subjective. So let's just go ahead and throw everything else, right? So when I'm looking at my life and I'm looking at the things that have happened to me and the questions that I've asked and these great conversations like this that have come, the one thing I really appreciate is someone being willing to give me their time. And again, thank you so much. I really do appreciate this. And I'm honored. I really am. I'm happy to have it. But I do know that every time I've gone into some pretty extensive research regarding any of these subject matters, I've only come back with a more emboldened faith. So I would really appreciate this opportunity. I don't need you to research anything. I want you to just give me your questions, because I really want to sort those things out. And if what you are saying is true, I'm going to have to own up to it. So
yeah, and I'm not trying to play gotcha. I'm trying to get you.
I don't see that at all.
This is my issues with the Gospels and why I can't accept them as historically accurate, because they can't be historically accurate. They're different accounts. Like I said, Luke has Jesus being born in 20 years after Matthew does.
Right.
So
yeah, no, I'm happy. That's great.
So just read Mark.
I will
read Mark and answer 2 questions.
Okay.
What was Jesus's mission, and who was his mission for? What was his message for, and why did he die? And just Mark, and try to read it through the lens of a first century Jew, if you can.
What was his message for, and who did he die for?
Yeah. Who was he preaching to? What was it? Who was he here to save, and how to become saved through Mark? And I think if you read it through that, you'll see a different Jesus than what you're used to, because that Jesus. The Jesus of Mark is, I love the Gospel of Mark. You know, I know that gospel pretty inside out, which is why I always tell people to start there, because it's a very primitive. And you're going to think this sounds heresy, so excuse me. It's a very primitive human Jesus. That Jesus never claimed to be God. That Jesus never claimed to be, divine. He like I said, and you'll notice his miracles. He messes up a few times, and I think it humanizes him.
Yeah, and I'm human too, man. I don't know everything, and I certainly I'm not admitting that I have a complete knowledge of the scriptures, and I'm I learn every day. I really do. I take these questions to heart, and I really do look through them, and I appreciate it. I really do.
Well, thanks for your time, and like I said, let's do this again in a couple of weeks, and we'll have a second to talk and bring me some more questions, because I don't want to feel like I'm the only one asking you questions.
I will. I guess I don't have good enough ones, because I wasn't really prepared for the conversation, but yeah.
It's not, I do this. I wasn't prepared, but I do this more often. So
yeah. Well, I do appreciate your time, man. Thanks.
No worries.
Thank you. Thank you for setting this meeting up. And